Good evening. Welcome to this session. We have this session is titled From Indonesia to India, a long view for the G20. We have three global experts here with us. My name is Akshay Mathur. I am the director of ORF Mumbai and also head of the ORF Geoeconomics program. What we are doing today is a day-long dialogue on the G20, on globalization, on global economic governance. This session is the second to last session. We have three global experts here with us, Jim McGann, Feride Ainan, and Claude Lopez. Welcome. Jim is with the University of Pennsylvania. Feride is dialing in from Turkey. She was an integral part of the T20 and the G20 process for Turkey under the Turkish presidency of the G20 in 2015. Claude is dialing in from the United States, the West Coast. She was an integral part actually of the French G20 presidency in 2011, but has since been working on many global economic issues. And of course, Jim has been broadly looking at global governance, the role of think tanks on global economic issues. So I welcome the three of you. This session here is a session that follows the session which was looking back at the G20. So this session is actually looking forward at the G20 on how we can develop probably a multi-year agenda for the G20, what's in store for the G20 and global economic governance for the next 2 to 3 years. So what we will do is I'd like my guests here to take the first 4 or 5 minutes for opening remarks, the questions that we are trying to address, and then we will come back for a round of questions, moderated questions that I will pose to you. And we also have a set of, our question box is also open to the public that is dialing in. So then I will curate, if we are left with time, I'll curate the questions over to you. So why don't I start here with Feride. Feride, you have the floor for your opening remarks. You have to unmute yourself, yeah.
Okay, is it working now? It's good, yeah. Thank you very much, Akshay, for the introductions. And I want to thank the Observatory Research Foundation for inviting me to this web conference. So Akshay said that we would be presenting a more looking forward agenda for the G20. But I do want to begin my talk by addressing the question of what the G20 is about. So I will go in a bit into the history of the G20 here. I want to emphasize two key features here of the G20. One is regarding inclusivity, and the second one regarding the flexibility of the G20 as an economic governance platform. So first, regarding the inclusivity aspect and representation. As we all know, the G20 was established in 1999 after the financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis. And at that time, the G20, it brought into focus the interconnectedness of the global financial system. Then following the 2008 financial crisis, it was elevated to the leaders level. What was unique about this, when G20 declared itself the premier forum for global economic governance, was that it demonstrated the centrality of multilateralism between advanced economies and emerging markets. So it went further than simply highlighting interconnectedness. It meant recognizing multiplicity of actors in that economy. This inclusivity aspect was a central agenda during the Turkish presidency when our institution, TEPAV, led the Think 20 process. Then we the Turkish presidency prioritized the concerns of low-income developing countries that year, as well as SMEs. It is also the year when the G20 growth agenda started becoming better aligned with the global development agenda. The following year, inclusivity was a major topic during the Chinese presidency, and the major highlight was innovation as a central theme, where innovation was central to medium to long-term growth strategies, but also to sustainable development. So putting aside inclusivity, my second point is about the flexibility of the G20. The G20 does not have a secretariat and is not burdened by bureaucracy in its activities. It also does not have enforcement power. And though it doesn't have enforcement power, what it does best is to bring together leaders around an annual agenda and burning issues. A core objective has been providing support and direction, giving direction to the relevant international institutions such as the IMF, OECD, and so forth. And it supports the strategies of these organizations, whether it be global financial regulation, institutional representation in international institutions, global inequalities, trade, climate change, and so forth. What it does is that it highlights the immediacy and the current relevances of these global agendas and their long-term objectives. For instance, in the case of inequalities, it has become urgent to address them in relation to the current COVID-19 pandemic, which is aggravating existing inequalities and creating new ones. The COVID also revealed the weak belly of the global economy in terms of unsustainable inequalities in income and wealth. More people now, more poor people with weak immune systems, with little or no access to healthcare, are dying and are exposed to the virus more than the rich. Similarly, poor people who are employed in menial jobs that require face-to-face contact are losing income streams while lacking access to adequate social protection. What is more, is that the pandemic may be expediting the digitization of the workforce. That means setting into motion a rising trend in labor displacement, unemployment, and alternatively an uptick in employment in the gig economy with little or no employment protection. The slowdown in economic activity today is also challenging SMEs more than big enterprise, especially those in developing countries. So the pandemic, the current economic crisis, provides leaders, I would say, the G20 and the Leaders Summit, an opportunity to bring into focus long-term global mega trends, in this case inequalities, labor market tensions, and to open up a discussion for possible solutions. Providing a platform for such discussion has been a key feature of the G20 in the past. So coming back to more the exact topic of this panel, a long view for the G20. So regarding inclusivity, well, in the past years, the inclusivity agenda within the G20 did gain substance, especially with the alignment of the growth and development objectives. What I think needs to be done now in the context of the pandemic and the current economic crisis is that we need to bring the local regional debates to the global G20 level. I think the Italian, Indonesian, and the Indian presidencies will be more responsive to these debates. Major emerging markets like India and Indonesia, I think we can count on them to introduce fresh perspectives on less developed regions, SMEs, and regional development. For one, in terms of agendas, the post-pandemic recovery will require massive public investments to jumpstart economies. Here, emerging markets, developing regions may fall behind without fiscal space. Further, key agenda topics for this period should include hard issues like technology transfer, addressing disruption of labor markets with technology, digital inclusion, building of green infrastructure, as well as greater multi-stakeholder dialogue, public-private sector dialogue to facilitate these processes. My second point is going to relate a bit to the role of the T20 in this, the Think 20, which I was involved with, as Akshay mentioned, in 2015. In the T20, we felt a unique responsibility to provide fresh policy options to contribute to the debate within the G20. So this meant beyond what needs to be done, we wanted to focus on how it will be done and who will do it. I think this is something that needs to become a major way of handling thing in the for future T20s. Second related, the Think 20 can serve as a bridge between the G20 and other engagement groups, the Business 20, the Labor 20, and open lines of communication between them. This way, as I mentioned, about public-private sector dialogue, the Think 20 can really help in this, in facilitating such dialogue in the post-COVID recovery period. Thirdly, in Turkey, we felt that T20 could use its position of not being an advocacy platform to provide a long-range perspective on global issues. This is also what we would like to see the G20 do to consider as a future goal for itself, meaning that it can play a role in providing a long-term vision. Here I'll give an example. In 2015, as a T20, we focused on technology and innovation for sustainable development as a top priority. That year we launched Innovation 20 Group, and it was also the first year that Internet as a word was included in the G20 communique, leaders' communique. Later on, in China, innovation became a bridge between the growth and development agendas. So this was, it wasn't a topic before, and it became one.
Feride, can I ask you to, yeah.
Sure.
I'll come back to you, but if you can just close on your opening remarks, then I can come back to you.
Okay. Yeah, well, so I'll leave it there, and then maybe continue with the question and answers.
Okay. I take your point that, you've talked about what Turkey did and how the long-term inequalities, how to bring local regional debates onto the global agenda, and tech transfer, labor, digital issues all need to be on the agenda. So I'll come back to some of those. Jim, the long view for the G20 from your perspective, looking ahead, you have Italy, Indonesia, and India, at least. What's your long view? Jim, please unmute yourself. Can you hear me? Jim, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was muted, and they've just released me. I think we have to look back before we look forward, and look at the empirical evidence. And in terms of key issues, in terms of representativeness and inclusiveness, in terms of a process that is both, has from its inception been designed to advance and deal with global economic crisis, but has expanded its agenda. The reality to include the SDGs and the goals of the SDGs. The T20 and G20 has not, based on empirical evidence and in terms of the institutions involved, achieved the objectives and achieved the intended and important goal of inclusiveness. And so when we look at the representativeness of the advisory panels across all of the T20, G20 summits that have taken place, Mexico and Argentina are the two that have been, in terms of its advisory capacity, most inclusive. Saudi Arabia has made it a major effort to include countries in this global south. And the empirical evidence is clear that the policy briefs and that are produced are dominated by the US, Germany, and other European countries. The vast majorities that are large countries that are impacted by the policies of the G20 and the SDGs are not represented, do not have an input, and therefore are not inclusive. And so when we look at countries that have hosted, just simply look at who they've had on their advisory panels. They were either exclusively from the country hosting or with a few sampling of countries in predominantly the US and Europe specifically and Germany specifically. And so, before we can speak truth to power, we must speak truth to ourselves. And while we are at a moment where, there is a very positive change, and I would suggest in the United States, the U.S. To be named and approved, U.S. ambassador to the UN said in her, once she was nominated, said, multilateralism, international cooperation, and diplomacy are back. They may be back, but the challenges to the credibility and legitimacy of the T20 and G20 remain, and we must be motivated toward reform as we go forward. And I would point out that the next, after Italy, and for the first time in the history of the G20, there will be 3 successive countries in the global south. The reforms that need to take place in advance of that. Today, think tanks and international intergovernmental organizations are confronted with a daunting set of issues and dilemmas and must operate in a policy environment that is characterized by more issues, actors, competition, and conflict. This is precisely why we need to forge a more meaningful international partnerships and transform our organizations so they can be fit for purpose and can effectively manage the increased velocity of information and policy flows that have been driven by a set of technological, political, and economic disruptions. To meet these challenges, all organizations, including the UN, the G20, etc., must be smarter, better, faster, tech-savvy, and above all else, innovative and agile if we are to have any chance of addressing the clear and present danger we face from transnational issues like the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, climate change, food and water insecurity, global financial crises, and of course, global pandemics. I think that it is essential that we call for a new and more inclusive governance model for the T20 and G20 that involves an international advisory board with think tank representatives from all G20 countries and regional entities like the African Union and ASEAN. It is, in terms of the G20 and the G20, to me unconscionable and inappropriate that the EU, with 27 countries as its members, has a seat on the G20 and the T20, and Africa, with 54 countries, has no voice and 1 country on the G20. These things are easily solvable and can achieve and enhance the credibility and legitimacy of the G20 and T20. Frankly, the T20 must walk the walk and take demonstrable steps to engage think tanks in the global south in order to achieve inclusivity, diversity in its proceedings and governance structure. Over the last 4 years, the T20 will, over the next 4 years, the T20 will be hosted by Italy, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and it is critical that these reforms are in place in advance of the rotation through the global south. The T20 itself faces a crisis of confidence and credibility that can only be addressed if there is a commitment to create a T20 that is more representative, resilient, and responsive. How can the T20 and the G20 hope to advance its goals and commitment to SDGs when the think tanks from the global south are not adequately represented in the T20 and the majority of policy briefs, and this is an important piece of empirical evidence, that the majority of the policy briefs are produced by think tanks in the US, Germany, and other European countries. In short, the T20 must become as modern as 5G, AI, and as diverse as the global marketplace of ideas. Failure to embrace reforms will lead to further erosion of credibility, effectiveness, and trust in the T20 and G20. The current challenges facing the T20 include some of the following. 1, discontinuity and a lack of institutional memory. Each country understandably has a desire to put its imprimatur on the G20 agenda, but that creates a degree of and lack of continuity and certainly institutional memory. The lack of diversity and inclusiveness must be addressed. A governing structure that is not representative and does not reflect the established best practices for INGOs and governing principles must be implemented for the T20. A lack of dedicated financial resources for the T20 and G20 country hosts is also a major issue. There's a need for greater financial transparency and accountability. Who is shaping and influencing the agenda? There are serious time pressures. Producing a major global, high-stakes G20 summit in 12 months or less is in itself problematic. A lack of policy relevance and impact and policy uptake, the lack of clarity, which is a key issue regarding the purpose, the role and purpose of the T20, and the instrumental role the think tanks play in shaping and advancing the G20 agenda is another key issue. I would like to take the opportunity to make a few modest proposals to address some of these core issues.
Jim, can you please bring the opening remarks to a close? I can come back to you.
Yep, will do. I'll end here, and we can come back, and I'll make some suggestions in terms of reforms.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'll give you the first opportunity when we...
In closing, the major issue is that in terms of the UN, in terms of the G20, in terms of INGOs, there are a better set of operating principles in terms of transparency and good governance that are not reflected in the T20, and the T20 must not only talk the talk, but walk the walk.
Okay. I'll give you the first chance when we do the second round, because I know you have to go. Claude, you're back here. You're with us. Sorry, you had some technical difficulties. We got a chance from Feride and to hear the opening remarks from Feride and from Jim. They were both talking about a little bit about the past, but also looking at the lessons on how it can be applied to the future. So maybe opening remarks from you, Claude, on what's your long view on the G20?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Akshay. Thank you for the invitation, and hopefully this worked correctly. So I think what I'm going to add to all what have been said, because it's very
5 to 7 minutes, please, Claude. Huh? Yeah.
Sorry.
So 5 to 7 minutes opening remarks,
yes,
please.
Yes, don't worry. I'm going to stick to the guidelines that you provided, and it's going to be a pragmatic approach regarding what can be done. So there is some continuity in the G20 agenda with some real change. And what we saw from what Feride and James said is whenever the G20 was a successful platform is whenever we had a more than a one-year type of agenda. And we saw that with the macroprudential policy, which I define as being a success. But for that to happen, what we end up having is, of course, a big command shock, but also a desire of moving forward along a strategic line that has been defined for more than 1 year, and accountability, specific benchmarks, specific goals on 2 to 3 years horizon with things to be achieved within a year. And if we consider that the G20 has the power of clearly influence at the global level, a policy framework, then ideally, the type of discussion that we should have first is try to define what should be the agenda for the next 3 to 5 years. And of course, on the long term, they need coherence with other sustainable goals from the UN and other things that other big institutions are doing. But I don't see the G20 as an institution, but a platform. And we also need to be extremely realistic and pragmatic regarding what can it do and how and the channel. So the lack of funding may be an issue, but that also provides flexibility to actually provide alternative solutions. So if we look forward, whenever I'm thinking about what could be the type of policy in line with what we saw with financial stability and the macroprudential policy, well, I really think that there is consensus regarding the fact that technology is having such a change at the global level, and it's very much a cross-border issue or challenges to understand or to provide an effective oversight across a lot of very different sectors, across a lot of very different countries, depending on whether you're emerging, develop or developing. Your perception of technology, and in that I include big tech, is different. Could be positive, more positive, let's say, whenever you're focusing on financial integration, and maybe less positive if you're focusing on financial stability. Both issues are really two sides of the same coin, and that's why G20 is essential for this type of discussion, because it's a platform. Even though it's restrictive, we still have 20 key players in the world that are representative of a lot of different viewpoints. And I do agree with James that for historically speaking, there were a strong predominance from the US and Europe driving a lot of maybe policy, but that should not be the case moving forward. And tech and really trying to have a smart oversight of tech. I'm not talking about regulation. I'm really trying to understanding this shift in the economy and trying to make the maximum of it. So G20 is a great platform. So we talk about the G20, we talk about the T20, but I also would like to talk about the B20, because without the private sector, there is not much can be done if we really want to have a pragmatic approach. And I do think that whenever we want to be inclusive, of course, in terms of region and country, but also in terms of players. A lot of initiatives moving forward that are successful and that will be successful tend to be partnership between private and public. So they need to be effective discussion. You know, all parties need to be able to communicate to reach again this oversight that will be done effectively. And I think in that engagement, also what we also need to expand is a type of player even among the regulators. I talked about technology, digitalization of the economy. That means there need to be more and more voices that are representative of that environment, the tech environment. And I know it's challenging because technology environment doesn't automatically speak the same language, because even though we can look at the same thing, you clearly see that here in the US, looking at Silicon Valley and look at all the innovation that came out and how suddenly people are surprised about the social impact of those technological innovation, even from the people within Silicon Valley. And you see that there is a very fast evolution regarding that perception, but there is a need of the same way we have central bank and we have the finance tracks, which is extremely effective and a proven record of success. They need to be expansion of what are the core expertise that we need to have in those G20 discussion to really understand the evolution and how to tackle policy and global policy differently. Whenever I say differently is moving forward, anything that is related to the digitalization of the economy cannot be based on small tweak of regulation from the past, because it's a totally different setup, a totally different approach. If we really want to leverage technology at its best for inclusion, for all the good things that we hope, we also need to adjust properly the regulatory framework. And all that is part of the key step. But just to summarize, I think that whenever you want to be effective and have a success, you need to make sure that you're held accountable to what you say. And to do that, it's a strategic plan of 5 years with specific goals that account for the diversity of the different countries. Okay, so it's not one goal for all, but and so it's a pragmatic way of being strategic, but we're still thinking that this platform, and I truly believe that, is a really good and complementary channel to create coordination across global power in a time where, well, sometimes some of those countries will not be willing to coordinate.
Okay. Well, I think what I find as a common thread across all the three interventions, because you've asked for a multi-year, ideas for a multi-year agenda, ideas for a multi-stakeholder approach, and you've all identified that there is some issue with inclusivity. I mean, as if the G20 as a process itself and its work in addressing the challenges is not addressing inclusivity. Neither is it neither is it addressing it as a forum, nor is it addressing it as an agenda item. So how can leaders, how can the Sherpas address this? Jim, let me come to you. You had some suggestions. So let me start with you in the second round. How can leaders address this? You have to unmute. I think you're still muted.
First and foremost, let me point out the progress that has been made. Saudi Arabia placed a primacy on inclusiveness and made an aggressive effort to reach out. The whole issue of creating a more digital, inclusive, and policy relevant agenda is the three stools of the Italian ISPI agenda. So the agenda for reform and commitment to reform is there. The issue of continuity, largely a result of some of the structural and formality of the G20, that the country that follows can't do anything until the country that has concluded the G20 not to. The reality is there are many things that can be done. You are doing it. Italy's doing it in an informal way to move the process forward, to make it great and achieve greater continuity and quality improvement and policy relevance. That being said, there's still more work to be done, and I'll point out a number of things that can be done. One, establish a global, inclusive, and representative governing board to help mobilize the financial, intellectual, and institutional resources necessary to enhance and sustain the T20 and the G20. This will be key as we rotate through countries in the global south where meaningful partnerships, not dependencia, but meaning partnerships will need to be forged between countries in the north and the south. Launch an outreach effort to the 9,000 think tanks around the world and engage them in the T20 process. There are many, many think tanks in the developing world, in Asia, Southeast Asia, in Africa, Latin America, who do not participate in the process, but are extraordinary institutions. Develop strategies to accelerate the digitalization of the T20 process, policy briefs, and proceedings, so that it reaches more people. Develop strategies to dramatically increase the G20's adoption of the recommendations of the T20 and policy uptake of its research proposals by global, regional, and national governments around the world. Create a standing secretariat that would rotate every 3 or 4 years. The secretariat would be hosted by a leading think tank with the capability to support and sustain the T20 in every region of the world, and it would rotate and not be exclusively in the north, but rotate to every region in the world. Mobilize the resources, and this is key in terms of increasing the inclusiveness. Mobilize the resources to involve in a meaningful way think tanks from the global south in the development of policy briefs and the participation in the T20 proceedings through a T20 policy, research, and travel grants program. I was shocked in 2 of the major summits that took place that the only representatives were Africans from Brookings, and only one institution from Africa was not representative. However, suggested that it was representing the entire continent of Africa. These things are inexcusable. The solutions to them are simple and must be embraced and operationalized. And finally, as I've indicated, as an easy solution, add the African Union and ASEAN as members of the G20 and T20. That way you are including the regions and not violating the the nature of the G20 member country. I am sorry, but I have a doctor's appointment that I could not reschedule and took months to get. So I must leave you now, but I want to thank you, ORF, which has done admirable work and is preparing to take on the mantle 3 years from now as the host. And that's what should be happening across the board. There is no reason why we should not work informally. In 2011, in advance of Cabos, I convened all of the G20 foreign policy think tank from around the world, and virtually every one of the think tanks that were there from the countries that hosted after that, starting with Mexico, all of those institutions eventually became the host for the T20. And so there is no reason why informally we can't strengthen one another, especially those that are 2 or 3 years ahead. It improves the quality and advances and sustains the important work of the G20 and its focus on sustainable development goals. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, we're okay. You should get to your doctor's appointment.
Okay, bye-bye.
We will carry on the conversation. I want to come to Feride. I thought that you were critiquing the G20 to say that it has not been as inclusive in its agenda. And then Jim came along and Claude came along and just reasserted the points that you were making, that it has not been inclusive. In fact, Jim said that the process itself has not been inclusive. So what suggestions do you have, Feride? Like, how can we take the agenda forward? There is obviously the Italian presidency, there's the Indonesian presidency, there's the Indian presidency, and there are processes which will continue. What can we do about this?
Yes. So yes, the past few years as I've been observing more from the outside since China, that there has been, I wouldn't say a lack of focus on inclusivity. Now I'm talking about the agenda, not the institutional aspect. There has been, but it hasn't been really, it's lost its bite, yeah? There's always, the one example I like giving is in the Chinese communique, there was a very strong emphasis on the issue of technology transfer, which was counterbalanced by IPR protection for the Western multinationals. When I look at the communiques now, I don't see that kind of hard issue being on the table. There's a lot of talk about how technologies are great for sustainable development, but there's no hard talk about it. Yeah. So I think what the G20 can do is to put these issues on the table in a more real, concrete way. Then when it comes to inclusivity, look, I think there's a big problem with, the elephant in the room is more than within, it's not just about G20 as a governance platform, what it can do about inclusivity, but there's a real problem with technology and its disruptive effects on labor markets. I don't think anyone knows the solution to this as of yet. And this is causing a lot of internal, inward-looking tendencies, especially in Western economies. And I don't know whether that can be dealt with on a global level, but I think that's really the driving force behind all these tensions as well. Institutionally, I would say within the, James is very right, it has the Think 20, especially we tried to do this during the Turkish presidency. It needs to be more representative, bringing in more perspectives from African countries, from developing countries which are not in the G20. And then also inclusive in terms of, as Claudia mentioned, bringing in private sector perspectives, which is especially important with this technological change. And maybe not only private sector, but also universities, research institutions, and the making of, the new regulations for this new industrial revolution. So that definitely has to take a more multi-stakeholder participation format in the future. Hello?
Claude, yeah, thank you, Feride. Claude, you spoke about maybe the lack of expertise, or maybe what you were indicating was that G20 itself would need to build some capacity to tackle some of these issues. You mentioned that one of the things that worked on the macroeconomic and macroprudential work was that it was very well defined. There was good oversight. There were regular checks, milestones to meet, and maybe there was expertise in the room, because the central bank and finance minister's track was very good. It still is probably a very effective track. But now that the conversation is broader, you do have more structural reforms on the table. You have more long-term agenda on the table. You have development issues on the table, which wasn't the case until 2012, 2013. If you have to do things like what Feride is saying, tackle more of the impact of digital and digitalization on labor market, how can the G20 create a structure or create a process in which this can be addressed? Does it have the capacity? I mean, you were involved with the French presidency of the G20 in 2011. I think you were on the finance track, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Central bank track. And so, but how can the G20 address all these other issues? Does it have the capacity? Can it develop a multi-year, multi-stakeholder approach?
So that's a trade-off, though. Is that if you really want to cover all the topic and you become so broad that then in terms of knowledge and power of making a change or having some really useful insight, you're becoming very thin. And that's why whenever we come to the macroprudential policy and Basel III, what we have the BIS, which is the central bank of the central bank. That's been a very well established institutional hub of central banks. So they were already a very strong institutional bond among central banks. And then, Basel III came after Basel II, so that means they were already a very well structured, and the novelty was the macroprudential. Okay, so that means another way to look at that is in front of the emergency, then regulators and legislators became extremely focused. And if there is a need or the desire of really doing truly something, they need to be the political will to prioritize which issue should be tackled first, and that whenever there will be actually change. So I'm not saying that labor market is not important or inclusiveness, but maybe it's also looking at all those issues and framing them differently. So whenever we talk about technology, it's very easy to have 100 different types of applications. But from where I'm standing, and if you look at consumer protection, financial stability, financial inclusion, one of the key elements of the technology and all those platform and digitalization is sharing information. So maybe one way to start really having a structured, very focused, I'm not talking about narrow, I'm talking about focus, one step at a time, type of agenda is really by addressing the strongest or the strongest commonalities across all those different issues that matter across sector, but across a lot of different countries. And that's where I would talk about this inclusiveness. Once we have that, then suddenly you can open a discussion with a broader audience, a broader audience of stakeholders. So that's where I was talking about the private sector, of course, think tank. I mean, I do think that everybody has, and government, of course, has some added value. Of course, private sector for me is very important because it's pragmatism. At the end of the day, they make things happen. And innovation often come from private sector or universities and think tank, and you need that. While from government, you may have continuity. This inertia can be a good thing, but that means also in terms of being able to retool or acquire the talent that is needed today or that will be needed tomorrow, they may have less of that ability. The other thing is in that yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go finish your.
No, and the other thing is, I truly believe that things are moving so fast that there is no way we can strengthen, let's say, central bank by just hiring some tech guys. Because if you remove experts from their field and you bring them, then suddenly they stop evolving and be at the edge. So that's why I was emphasizing this notion of communication, the ability to communicate to the sector. Yep.
careful with all the fintech work and digital currencies that are coming in. You might just
I know.
you might just
I
have
know.
all software engineers running central banks. But I have a question for you, Claude, a follow-up one, and Feride, same question to you. We have about 6 minutes left. We know that it is Italian, Indonesian, and Indian presidency. Anything in particular, any particular characteristic of these three countries, given what you've just said, what needs to be built in? Anything in particular that you think these three countries can do on the agenda, or they can work together, that would be characteristic of these three countries that they have within their capacity to do? Same thing for you, Feride, after Claude.
So would you be surprised if I talk about technology? I do believe that now is the time to talk about data. It's a great opportunity. Italy is in Europe, and then you have Indonesia and India in Asia is seeing the way of dealing with data. Those are very different angles. You have a unique opportunity to have a more than 1 year type of agenda. And then what's happening? China is regulating big tech. Even the US are waking up. So there is a momentum where you can actually have something that matters for more than few countries. So that will be a common issue that I think the momentum will be the right one to really go deep on that.
Okay, fair enough. Feride, I'll end with your remarks. Yeah. I think you're on mute, so.
I keep forgetting. I agree with Claudia that the data is going to be a big topic. In addition to that, I think the G20 discussions would have a lot to benefit from regional development policy perspectives of these countries, of India and Italy as well. I know less about Indonesia. Also, once again, coming to this technology issue, I think if we're going to be talking about climate change mitigation, etc., we have to start talking about technology transfer, and I have a feeling that in India this is going to be definitely pushed forward. So
I think we will end the conversation here. I take the message from all the opening remarks that there is an issue with inclusivity, both in the governance and the institutional process of the G20, but also in terms of reaching out to the right people and having the right agenda in place, especially for the next three presidencies. We know who they are. We might even know the fourth one. So I also take from the second round of remarks that you made that some amount of capacity building is important. There was a reason why G20 worked really well. There was some structure that was put in place. That structure and capacity cannot be built overnight, but there are ways to do it. One can be smart about it. I think smart oversight is the word that you use, Claude. Feride, you said that there is a way in which more views can be brought in. Claude said B20, but you also mentioned different kinds of think tanks that were brought in from Turkey. I remember that the Turkish G20 process and the T20 and B20 was one of those presidencies that broke open and had so many conversations. I actually remember you were not able to manage. You were overwhelmed because you had so many views. But I remember that presidency and how Turkey managed it. But you set the G20 and the T20 and the B20 on a certain course from which we are all benefiting. And so we take that point very well. With that, I know that I'm not left with any time to take any questions, but I'd like to thank you both, Claude, for getting up really early in the morning. I know it's 4:30 in the morning on the west coast of the United States. Feride, thank you very much for joining us and forcing yourself to remember what happened in 2015 to provide us with the long view. And of course, Jim, who had to bail because of a personal emergency. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Akshay. Thank you, Feride. Bye.